Question for Mike. The government is proposing that recipients of government funding cannot campaign for changes in government policy for radical things like evidence-based intervention. Will that restrict adepts' ability to have a voice in the profession?
It never has in the past, so no, I don't think it will. There's one aspect I think probably important on all this, which is about the social value of the work that we do. And I think there's a really important piece of work, I think, to be done on how, just in terms of all funding, how work of transport affects other aspects of general life, really, and that, certainly in terms of social care and the cost of that. So I'd say no, it wouldn't. We would still have a conduit there, and we're often and are very much welcomed by certainly by DFT colleagues to come and talk to them about legislation and funding arrangements.
The points about the national kind of register of skills and the national digitised strategy, to me that sounds great. It sounds kind of standard and central and something where you can really pinpoint responsibility and resources. But coming from a local government perspective, I find all the kind of strategy at national and local government and how it all ties in together a little bit conflicting and confusing actually sometimes, that we've got different levels of responsibility, different levels of LEPs, as was pointed out earlier. So my question is, how do you see that kind of national register, national responsibility, national opportunities tying in with this kind of diverse, conflicting structure of national and local government that we've got at the moment?
I think one of the things that I find quite challenging about our sector is that we do have quite a lot of fragmentation in that respect. So there are quite a lot of bodies, and quite often regionally or very locally focused, which in many ways is right, because it is about meeting the needs of the local populace and being focused on the local issues that are there. But there has to be, I think, a golden thread from that sort of national strategy down through into those different parts. And I just sense that we don't have that golden thread of, well, in fact, I don't think we have a national strategy, so I guess it can only be a silver or a bronze thread as it might be at the moment. So I think we really do need to do that. But when I was thinking about today, talking to you guys today, one of the things I thought was, actually, what national bodies have we really got? In terms of actually pulling these strategies together. I mean, clearly DFT as a client organisation has a degree of responsibility to work with the various different client groups to pull that type of strategy together. But from a sort of industry client body, actually the only one I could really think of was the CIHT, actually, where many of these things come together. So I just wonder whether we need to question that and think about that a little bit more. But I think whatever we do, I think we do need to develop a national picture, and then we do need to create that thread through to make it a little bit more understandable for people, and hopefully deliver with a bit more consistency and a bit more excitement in terms of what we're doing.
Hi, Dominic Brown from Surveyor Magazine. It's a question primarily for Jonathan, but for all of the attendees here. We've been speaking to the CBI, and they've raised the point that the Treasury have responsibility for setting the scope for the National Infrastructure Commission's research. Now, does that not hamstring the NIC? Can it really be called an independent body if it can't set the scope of its own research? And will that prevent us from realising the kind of independent voice and national long-term thinking that we all want the NIC to deliver?
I think a couple of things. I think the Treasury is running the show now in terms of transport policy, and in some ways that's given it greater shape and direction than it had before, because I think they see the bigger picture, whereas there's a tendency in transport to silo it and want to balance competing interests within that silo. So, and I think overall I would say that's been positive. I think with the NIC, I suspect the Treasury are putting safeguards in there to prevent the NIC doing something that is that they just couldn't accept. I think that's unlikely to happen anyway, because the NIC is going to be brokering the various schemes that are ultimately going to be pretty obvious what those candidates are going to be. Hopefully, what we want to ensure is that they are listening very hard to what bodies like Transport for the North and Midlands Connect are saying, but also the larger city regions, because it has to be a kind of composite of what the biggest demands are from the biggest parts of the country, as well as ensuring some national consistency between them. So, in short, I'm not too concerned about the nature of what's in that Treasury consultation at the moment. I'm not really surprised by it. And I don't think Lord Adonis is the kind of person who would roll over to Treasury civil servants. I think he's more than capable of holding his own and making the kind of sensible decisions that the Treasury is expecting and looking for.
Just from my perspective, I think it's important to realise that this should be regarded as a bit of a long game. I think there are always the immediacies of this current Parliament. Every Parliament there will be a report from the Infrastructure Commission. I think what I see happening, and I wouldn't necessarily call it a golden thread, but what I see happening is that there is a thread. There is a thread through these bodies that feed into the Infrastructure Commission, and I think both whoever chairs whatever national body in the future, I think there needs to be recognition of what things are fed into that equation. So, Transport for the North, for example, their chair, John Cridland, has announced, he's made it very clear, we're in this for the long term. We're actually doing an independent economic review. We're seeing what will make the difference, not just in 3 or 4 years' time, but what will happen in many years' time. And it is a process. And I think providing people stick to it and governments stick to it, I think there is a golden thread. There will be the strategic economic plans of each individual LEP that will feed into this process. And obviously local authorities have provided input into the strategic economic plans. The economic plans will form the basis of whatever is needed to deliver within that subnational body, and the subnational body will also provide information to the Infrastructure Commission. I think there is a mechanism there, and I think there is an opportunity to think of it more as maybe a national transport plan, but for local issues, there are a lot more pressing issues. But I think there is the start and the makings of a golden thread.
Dan Anderson from Ringway. We've heard today about the strategic road network, the local road network, but also the emerging thoughts of a major road network as an intermediary between those two. I wonder, Mike, if ADEPT have a view on what that might mean if that was to come into play, and what that might mean to local authorities.
Well, my first point is that I hope it might mean a bit more money. But the issue, I think, is quite important here in that, and I'm not bleating on about it again, but there are differences in funding arrangements. And if there is a mechanism to recognise that the strategic road network doesn't just finish at the motorways, and there are important links beyond that, and there is a mechanism to support that through maybe some additional processes. ADEPT have asked the Minister whether he is prepared to consider the vehicle excise duty to be contributing towards the maintenance of the key route network as well as the strategic road network. We got a negative answer on that, but I'm not going to give up. But there are some issues here about it. The key route network, if you look at it in the context of managing the routes in terms of its importance, it's not just about building new bits of key route network, it's managing and maintaining it. And it is quite right that they ought to be of a slightly better maintained standard than some of the more rural and estate roads in the country. So I think there is an argument to go beyond just the local network into a key route network. Fully support what is being done by David in terms of it as a study in the think piece. And my view on it is if it provides a mechanism for additional funding and additional resource, yes.
Michael Self, RAC Foundation. We went to Nottingham last year, where they'd the only authority to actually use the levy on private parking spaces to support their tram system. Of course, all the people who own rather run-down buildings in the middle of Nottingham, shock horror, you're going to kill us all. Suddenly, they produce the new tram system. The middle of Nottingham becomes like the middle of Strasbourg, because they buy really good trams. Isn't there an opportunity to take a lead from Nottingham and have that elsewhere?
I can answer that. I think what Nottingham have done is really good, and it took a lot of bravery. There was, at the time, inevitably from businesses, a lot of reaction against workplace levy charging. It does provide a revenue stream beyond, and through the revenue stream you can borrow against that, you can build things like trams, and there is some benefits to that. It is more of an urban solution, I'd argue, not so much for the rural market town solution, but there's no doubt in my mind it was a brave step. Not many authorities have, or very few have gone down the route of workplace levy charging, but I think it's another bow in the armoury, if you like.
I think that there's more of a mood to look again at traffic restraint issues in the cities, what with the pressure around air quality and also around the need to have a much better urban realm, much more attractive urban realm in city centres. The scars are very deep from the experience of the various people who tried on road user charging, Manchester, Edinburgh, and even if you don't have a referenda, the politicians who propose it can often pay the price. However, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Workplace parking levy is arguably less contentious, plus boring old parking and just changing arrangements and narrowing roads, which is happening all the time anyway, although it doesn't kind of tick the exciting box of road pricing, it still has a similar effect in terms of traffic restraint. But the politics, in terms of doing something more big bang, the politics still remain very challenging, and it'll, I guess, come to the fore with, or have a new political context when we get into mayoral elections. And again, it might be quite a brave mayoral candidate when asked about whether they would ever introduce that, who would to give the kind of answer that people may be looking for. But I think in the background, traffic restraint is back in terms of people are thinking about how they can best deliver it, recognising the difficult politics.
I mean, I think I'd just add to that, and obviously it's a great example in Nottingham in terms of the workplace levy and driving some additional revenue from that. But I think it's almost inevitable, and in fact, well, it's going to happen, is that there'll be lots of different ways of trying to raise third-party funding to fund capital infrastructure in the country. Crossrail's another example of how business levies have funded or part-funded that scheme. Crossrail 2 is also looking at that. Rail devolution, already they're talking about, and I know Nicola Shaw hasn't presented her report yet, but I'm fairly sure that's going to say that actually they're going to be looking at how local communities and other areas can actually part fund infrastructure growth. So, it's something that's going to become commonplace. Might feel a little bit unusual, but I think it will become commonplace. And as you said, there'll be a variety of different ways of raising funds for doing that.
Listening to speakers talk about the urban environment and the good ideas that are being put into place there, and about the conflict in management of different LEPs and different urban management schemes. I wonder what the panel in general think about connectivity. We've heard about connectivity of the strategic road network to other routes. What about the connectivity of the urban hubs, if we think of them that way, to the bigger rural areas? I live in a rural area. It's in the southeast, as it happens, but it could be the same anywhere. And lots of people from my area, quite naturally, commute into an urban environment. And the reality of their journey, both to and from that urban environment, is entirely different from their experience once they get to the urban environment. So in the London area, there was a lot of talk recently about TfL maybe taking some control of South Eastern train network. I wonder what the panel think about that kind of thinking and how really we can join up the whole country, not just look at it in pockets.
Okay. Particularly interesting to me because of Derbyshire being largely predominantly on the west-hand side, a very rural county. We have market towns, successful market towns, very much self-supporting, but the issue about connectivity to those towns and maybe to the bigger centres is a real issue because public transport, for example, there is no incentive for commercial operators to pick up some of these less profitable routes. And as a consequence, local authorities all over the country are going to have to look, and are looking very closely at what supported bus network will look like. And I can assure you by 2021 there won't be much left of it in the current way that things are going. But the buses bill does offer some opportunity, and so does devolution. I think there needs to be some imaginative work done on how you provide connectivity, whether it's through hub and spoke or through links or demand responsive arrangements. But through the buses bill, through enhanced partnership arrangements, which I really welcome, and potentially franchising, there may well be a way of packaging this out, which might end up, and dare I say it may end up spreading the butter a little bit thinner across the whole process, but at least it'll give some degree of hope for accessibility to those people who rely on public transport massively. As far as the networks are concerned, there will be, as always, a very good and hopefully continued healthy supply of capital to enable us to carry out repairs to the roads. But there is this issue about connectivity, and I think it's up for people like me and my staff to think about ways of generating projects that maybe look around the centres of market towns. How do you get market towns more thriving? Rather than just looking solely at what happens to develop the big brownfield sites, what do you do to make the market towns or the smaller towns and the connectivity more sustainable in the future? Obviously digital connection is an important part of that. We are working very hard across the country through delivering broadband and digital strategies, and I think that's largely successful. But beyond all that, I think there is an issue about how we see. We're not going to leave the people of rural areas in isolation. We've got to find alternative ways of delivering, in my view.
Thank you. I think on governance, it is messy in England, partly because it's very complex economic, social, political geographies. We know what Scotland is, we know what London is. We know what England outside London is, but it's a big unit. And there are particular problems or issues with donuts around the largest centres like the South East. I think that there's also a tendency in this country to look at London and then see if we can use that as the design for everywhere else. Whereas actually in somewhere like the North, there is no London of the North, but it's in some ways more comparable to somewhere like Nord Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, where you've got post-industrial cities. There's no one that's the capital city. You've got big rural areas, and I think there are more models like that we might want to have a look at. I also think there's potential for more sophisticated forms of governance arrangements, because if we look at the London situation again, obviously London's transport relates quite heavily to what goes on in the southern counties, but the southern counties also need some kind of arrangements between themselves about the links across the south. And it is not impossible to have overlapping governance arrangements that that reflect the realities on the ground, rather than going, oh, we must have one system and jam it on. Or what tends to happen as well at the moment is this layering on of new systems without sufficient regard to what was there already. So it is messy. I feel slightly more optimistic at the moment that out of all this mess, some of the larger trends are the right ones, but I think we can learn not just from what's been effective in London, but in similar regions in Europe, about more sophisticated governance arrangements that will tackle some of these difficult issues around boundaries and overlaps.
I guess the only thing I'd say about that is that, think big and think to the future. And we talked a little bit about intelligent mobility, but, people's travel behaviours are changing, and things like mobility as a service, where the ownership model disappears, people don't own cars anymore, they buy transport packages in the same way they'd buy access to Spotify or Netflix, and will actually change the way that things operate, and actually may provide rural areas with better access to transport now, because it's a very targeted and efficient service. And so I think we do need to start thinking about how we weave that intelligent mobility strand through future strategies.
The title's Managing Transport in an Uncertain World. From your perspective, Philip, what does the rest of the world feel like in uncertainty terms at the moment?
That's a big question, Andrew. I guess, one of the things that I would say, I recently hosted an event actually, which was looking at some UK-based organisations and some organisations based in the US, all tackling the challenge of mobility and how to make it more effective. So, there was the Colorado DOT that had this big plan about how they were going to coincidentally create some of their national roads and give them higher primacy and some more money, to all about how they were going to look at technology, all the way through to the MTR in New York, which were talking about actually how do they improve end-to-end journeys for their customers. So, to be honest, the challenges I think being faced in the rest of the world, are no different to ours. I think. In many ways, I know whilst we might complain about how it works sometimes, actually I think our infrastructure is pretty good on a world stage. And yes, there are lots of different examples that you might pick out of things that are better, but I think there's a real desire and drive in the UK to continue to build a world-class leading transportation network. And what we ought to do is learn as much as we can from other parts of the world and feed that into our thinking.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to add to that, or?
I think there's a degree of convergence. I think if you look at places like New York City, and everyone has images in their head about New York, about those big canyons of traffic. Well, actually, they're getting rid of some of those. They're introducing big bike hire schemes, very similar tactics to those which are being employed in European cities. So I think there's some convergence. Perhaps the world cities are leading on that, but I think other cities will follow on. So I think perhaps even more than, say, 10 years ago, there is a strong case for this kind of networking, and the trends people are facing and the responses they're coming up with are converging. I think the positive thing is you can learn from some of the imaginative and innovative ways different cities have approached that.
One aspect of uncertainty that is particularly going to be affecting local government in the next few years is the government's unexpected decision to introduce the retention of business rate and all the consequences of that will see a huge diminution in the amount of central grant, not only from DCLG but also from DFT and other major grant programs from central government. I wonder if Mike or Jonathan would care to comment on how that's going to change the planning and funding landscape for local authorities, both those outside the combined authorities and within.
Thanks. A very, very interesting question, because we're having to do some scenario planning on the absence of revenue support grant. For example, in some parts of the country, that would probably mean that the business support, business rates would be a good thing. In other parts of the country, it may not. And there needs to be, and I think the government recognises this, there need to be some checks and balances on how this all plays out in the end, because the government basically keep business rates and then pass it out. And I think there needs to be some way of more even distribution, because otherwise there'll be some real major drops in income. That doesn't prevent authorities such as ours and through the LEP looking at obviously improving the opportunity for more businesses to grow and more business rates. We've got 3 very good enterprise zones in the LEP area, and one of those enterprise zones in my area, Markham Vale, is absolutely flying, and there are lots of new opportunities for businesses to grow there. But if I was to look at it broadly in the context of a north-south divide, you'll see more opportunities for business rate retention and profits in the south of the country than you would in the north, because by virtue of the development. And of course there is then the rurality issue. Those rural counties, they've got a huge amount of small, medium enterprises, not huge amounts of business rates, will suffer as a result. So I think there's real challenges there, and I hope the government will recognise that when it comes to the funding formula.
Okay, thank you. And Jonathan, would you like to?
Yeah, I think it's very complicated, particularly in the city regions, because we don't know yet where the various funding streams are going to go. Are they going to continue to go to districts? Are they going to go to the combined authority mayor? We don't know that yet. We don't know what's happening yet with things like Local Growth Fund Round 2, and we don't really know fully yet how the business rates thing is going to be sorted out. So, however, I think because of the timescales, the Manchester mayoral timescale, that will start to put skates under people to try and pull these threads together, but it is very complicated and very difficult to work out what's going to happen at the end of it. At the moment, I think it's about us delineating the problems and the issues, giving them back to government and putting it back onto them to sort it out.
Pleased to hear some reference to digital connectivity and indeed the wider theme of connectivity. We're reminded at the moment that London is some way down a league table of global cities when it comes to digital connectivity, and the concern from business that that's harming us in economic and financial terms. So back to the suggestion of a national strategy, which I fully support, but my question to the panel is, are we looking for a national highway strategy, a national transport strategy, or a national connectivity strategy?
Right, who wants to take that first? Philip, you want to go?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, I guess, you'd have to take the bigger picture view and say, if when you're looking at things like demand management and some of the impact on our travel networks, we've talked about investment in strategic highways network, but where do the people go once they get off the strategic highway? And, whether it's into London on a congested tube network or whether it's onto local roads that can't deal with the flow. Actually, we've got to look at the various different methods of demand management, and clearly having a really well interconnected environment that allows people to work much more effectively from their home location or from somewhere else, I think is pretty key. So, I think it's a good suggestion. I think in terms of defining the challenge, we need to really think about how that connectivity feeds into that.
For me, they're all important, and I think equally important as it stands at the moment. It's good to travel, and I think there is you never fail to recognise that people will still want to travel, and whether it's for different purposes. I mean, Derbyshire, we've got beautiful countryside. People travel into the Peak District because they want to go for a walk and cycle. So there is that. There's always going to be those tensions, and I think whether people are going to accept the virtual reality of travelling around the Peak District, I don't know, but. I think they're all equal, and I think they will balance. In the end, things will be slightly more slanted towards digital because people can work from home, people can get data more easily. I think, but there'll always be a need for travel, and there'll also be a need for transport.
Okay,
I think it's a very good point, and I think it's another example of how we need to break down another wall between silos, between digital connectivity and transport connectivity. And going back to what do businesses want, what do people want from city centres, I think it is about they want that reliable digital connectivity, but they also want that urban realm where they can go around, work in different cafes, meet people and be much more flexible. I think that's what they want. But we don't really have the tools at the moment to work out which is the biggest priority. And I think it also goes back to that wider balance between what we're doing on good old-fashioned big short stretches of infrastructure and what we might do in our city centres about creating that urban realm which is fully wired up, which I kind of instinctively feel is something that could be delivered on quite a relatively rapid timescale for the money and would bring around big benefits. But I think it's a debate we need to continue, and it'd be good to have a chat afterwards.
May I thank our speakers here for 3 excellent presentations and a very, very thoughtful debate. Thank you very much indeed.